Genesis 10, am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. Genesis 10, the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Verse 1 is the generations of Noah. Verse 2 is Japheth. Verse 6 is Ham. Verse 8, Nimrod became the first monarch, first king. Descendants of Canaan. Verse 21, the sons of Shem. And later on, when we get into how God wipes out total populations, it comes into some of these genealogies. There's some who turned to God, and those who were started, their cities were started in rebellion to God. And so you have to look at the background. We don't know what God knows. So he wiped them out for good reason, but it centers in things that are happening here. Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, Shem's descendants to Abraham. The first verse is one language in the world. Verse 2 is the building of Babel. Verse 5 is interrupted by the confusion of tongues and the builders dispersed. By the way, the Tower of Babel wasn't supposed to be something to reach into heaven. It was twofold. One, it was supposed to negate any effect of a flood.
Exactly.
The second part was, on the top of them, we know that they're ziggurats because it's in Babylon. So at the top of the ziggurats, and one of those ziggurats was the Tower of Babel, was worship. There was a place of worship of false gods. And so it was more of a temple to false gods and built in rebellion to God. It had more to do. I mean, they were trying to reach heaven. Even they were smart enough to know that. But anyway, verse 5, it's interrupted by the confusion of tongues. The builders dispersed. Number 10 is the generations of Shem. We're going to go back over these books, even though we've gone through this overview or something like it. I think it would be good to get that in order before we go on. Verse 27, the generations of Terah, who was the father of Abraham, and then 31, Terah with Abraham and Lot moved from Ur to Haran. In Genesis 12, God sends Abram to Egypt. Verse 1, God calls Abram and blesses him with a promise of Christ. Verse 4, he departs with Lot from Haran and comes to Canaan. Verse 6, he journeys through Canaan. Verse 7, which is promised to him in a vision. Verse 10, he is driven by famine into Egypt. Verse 11, fear makes him feign his wife to be his sister. Verse 14, Pharaoh, having taken her from him, is compelled to restore her, because if he didn't, he was going to die. Verse 18, Pharaoh reproves Abram, whom he dismisses. So in other words, he said, you just about got me killed. For Genesis 13, Abram and Lot part ways. Abram promised many descendants. Verse 1, Abram and Lot return with great riches out of Egypt. Verse 6, strife rises between Abram's herdsmen and those of Lot. Number 8, Abram allows Lot to choose his part of the country. Verse 10, Lot goes towards Sodom. Verse 14, God renews his promise to Abraham, because that's all part of that separation. When finally that final separation, then God renews the promise. Verse 18, he moves to Haran, and there he builds an altar. And of course, Abram, he is the big altar builder in the Bible. Genesis 14, Abram rescues Lot, receives a blessing from Melchizedek. And then this is where God reveals. See, I'm talking about how he reveals his name. And here he reveals himself as the Most High God. And that Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God. And so that was because they believed in this region that there were gods and everything, and that their God he may have been God of the valley, but he wasn't God of the mountain. And Abram said, no, he's the Most High God. God was saying, I'm the Most High God. I'm the God of the valley, I'm the God of the mountain, I'm the God of here, I'm the God of there. So anyway, verse 1, the battle of 4 kings against the kings of Sodom and his allies. So verse 12 is Lot's taken prisoner. Verse 14, Abram rescues him. Verse 17, Melchizedek blesses Abram, who gives him tithes. Verse 21, Abram restores the rest of the spoils to the king of Sodom. Looking at this, we can see, and we're going to go into the book of Genesis from a little bit different angle than what we talked about before, but we see that this is laying the foundation for all that comes after. All the law and the sacrifices and all, they have their foundation here. Genesis 15, God's covenant with Abram. Number 1, God encourages Abram who asks for an heir. Verse 4, God promises him a son and multiplying of his seed. Verse 6, Abram is justified by faith. Verse 7, Canaan is promised again. Verse 9, and confirmed by a sign and a vision. And verse 18, prophetic of the condition of his prosperity till brought out of Egypt. Genesis 16 is Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael. This is really where the conflict in the Middle East begins. Sarai being barren, verse 1, gives Hagar to Abram. Verse 4, Hagar being afflicted for despising her mistress runs away. Verse 7, an angel commands her to return and submit herself. Verse 10, promises her a numerous posterity. Verse 12, and shows their character and condition. Verse 13, Hagar names the place and returns to Sarai. Verse 15, Ishmael is born. 16 is the age of Abram. Genesis 17 is the covenant of circumcision. Verse 1, God renews the covenant with Abram. Verse 5, and changes his name to Abraham in token of a greater blessing. And number 9, circumcision is instituted. Verse 15, Sarai's name is changed to Sarah, and she is blessed. Verse 17, Isaac is promised, and the time of his birth is fixed. Verse 23, Abraham and Ishmael are circumcised. Genesis 18, God promises the birth of Isaac, and his name means laughter. Abram pleads for Sodom. Verse 1, the Lord appears to Abraham who entertains angels. Verse 9, Sarah is reproved for laughing at the promise of a son. Verse 16, the destruction of Sodom is revealed to Abraham. Verse 23, Abraham makes intercession for its inhabitants. Genesis 19, the destruction of Sodom. Lot's daughters give birth. Number 1, verse 1, Lot entertains 2 angels. Verse 4, the vicious Sodomites are smitten with blindness. Verse 12, Lot is warned and in vain warns his sons-in-law. Verse 15, he is directed to flee to the mountains, but obtains leave to go into Zoar. Verse 24, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Verse 26, Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. Verse 29, Lot dwells in a cave. Verse 31, the incestuous origin of Moab and Ammon. See, some of these, the way they began, some of these groups, we have to understand the roots of it to understand God's attitude toward it later on. Genesis 20, Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech. Abraham sojourns at Gerar. Verse 2, denies his wife who is taken by Abimelech. Verse 3, Abimelech is reproved for her in a dream. Number 9, he rebukes Abraham. Number 14, he restores Sarah. Number 16, and reproves her. Number 17, Abimelech and his family are healed at Abraham's prayer. Genesis 21, Isaac born, Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, and the treaty at Beersheba. Verse 1, Isaac is born and circumcised. And circumcision may seem like a arbitrary thing. You know, why would God do that? And it just seems sort of barbaric. But as we go along, we'll see everything has a reason. And circumcision actually did have a very, very good reason. But it just wasn't revealed at this time. I'm sure when these people were going through the rite of circumcision, they were not happy. But God doesn't always reveal everything, and there was a really good reason later on when you get down into Egypt. There was a reason that circumcision became very, very important. Verse 6, Sarah is joy. Number 8, Isaac is weaned. Number 9, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. Verse 15, Hagar is in distress. Number 17, the angel relieves and comforts her. Verse 23, Abimelech's covenant with Abraham at Beersheba. And out of this chapter 21 basically comes why there's so much conflict between the sons of Ishmael and the sons of Isaac, the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac, and why Islam even came into being, and why the Islamic people believe they have as much claim to the Holy Lands as the Jews. And it all has to do with the Quran and the Bible. I believe, that the Bible is true and that the Jews are the children of promise. But there is in the Quran, and it dates to this. In fact, both the Quran and the Bible tell this story basically the same. The only difference is that the promise was given to Ishmael in the Quran. The promise is given to Isaac in the Bible. But that's why there's a conflict. And why that when you say to Islamic people, oh, the Jews are the child of promise, they get very upset. They don't like that. They say, you have no right to say that. Because it says in the Quran. Of course, then you've got to say, well, I don't believe the Quran, and I think the Quran is a spiteful book that is a very cheap imitation of the Torah. But anyway, that's not really a good conversation starter. But anyway, Genesis 22, the offering of Isaac, Nahor's sons. Abraham is tested with the command to offer Isaac. Number 3, he gives proof of his faith and obedience. Number 11, verse 11, the angel prevents him. Number 13, verse 13, Isaac is exchanged for a ram. And here's this revelation, verse 14, the place is called Jehovah Jireh. Every time God did something, that name, it was always a Jehovah, but this was God will provide. But there was always the revelation of God's name and nature. I don't think we've even seen all that God is yet. But hopefully we'll see a lot of it when we get to heaven. But remember, verse 15, Abraham is again blessed. Verse 20, generations of Nahor to Rebekah. Genesis 23, the death and burial of Sarah. Verse 1, the age and death of Sarah. Verse 3, the purchase of the field in the cave of Machpelah, which was the only piece of ground Abraham got, even though he had the promise. He realized at this point that the promise wasn't for him. I mean, it was for him, but it was beyond him. He wasn't going to receive it in his lifetime. But his descendants were. Verse 19, where Sarah is buried. Genesis 24, Isaac and Rebekah. Verse 1, Abraham swears his servant. Number 10, the servant's journey. Number 12, his prayer. 14, his sign. 15, Rebekah meets him. Verse 18, fulfills his sign. Verse 22, receives jewels. 23, shows her kindred. Verse 25, invites him home. Verse 26, the servant blesses God. Verse 29, Laban entertains him. Verse 34, the servant shows his message. Verse 50, Laban and Bethuel approve it. Verse 58, Rebekah consents to go and departs because it was up to her. She would go. Verse 62, Isaac meets and marries her. Genesis 25 is Abraham's death and Ishmael, Jacob, and Esau. 2,700 years we're traversing, or actually 2,400 of 2,700 years of the Pentateuch we're traversing in these chapters in Genesis. Genesis 25, Abraham's death, Ishmael, and Jacob, Esau. Verse 1, the sons of Abraham by Keturah. Verse 5, the divisions of his goods. Verse 7, his age, death, burial. Verse 11, God blesses Isaac. Verse 12, the generations of Ishmael. Verse 17, his age and death. Number 19, Isaac prays for Rebekah being barren. Verse 22, the children strive in her womb. Verse 24, the birth of Esau and Jacob. Verse 27, their different characters and pursuits. And verse 29 is Esau sells his birthright. Genesis 26, Isaac and Abimelech. Isaac, in verse 1, because of famine, sojourns to Gerar, and the Lord blesses him. Verse 7, he is reproved by Abimelech for denying his wife. Verse 12, he grows rich, and the Philistines envy his prosperity. Verse 18, he digs wells. Verse 23, God appears to him at Beersheba and blesses him. Verse 26, and Abimelech makes a covenant with him. Verse 34, Esau's wives. Genesis 27, Jacob gets Isaac's blessing. Verse 1, Isaac sends Esau for venison. Verse 6, Rebekah instructs Jacob how to obtain the blessing. So it's all subterfuge. Verse 14, Jacob, feigning to be Esau, obtains it under a false pretense. Verse 30, Esau brings venison. Verse 33, Isaac trembles. Verse 34, Esau complains and by importunity obtains a blessing. In other words, begging for it. He desires it. Verse 41, he threatens Jacob's life. Verse 42, Rebekah disappoints him by sending Jacob away. Genesis 28, Jacob's flight to Laban and visions of a ladder. Verse 1, Isaac blesses Jacob and sends him to Padan Aram. Verse 6, Esau marries Mahulath, the daughter of Ishmael, which that's an unholy alliance right there. And it mixes up more the Middle East. But anyway, verse 10, Jacob journeys and has a vision of a ladder. And verse 18, the stone of Bethel. And verse 20 is Jacob's vow. That chapter realizes God's attitude. It tells us why God had the attitude that he had towards Esau. Esau was very much an attitudinal problem, a spiritual attitude problem. Genesis 29, Jacob meets Rachel, serves Laban, marries Rachel and Leah. Verse 1, Jacob comes to the well of Haran. Verse 9, he becomes acquainted with Rachel. Verse 13, Laban entertains him. Verse 18, Jacob covenants for Rachel. Verse 23, he's received by Laban with Leah. But then, of course, the agreement was that he marries Rachel and he serves for her 7 more years. Verse 28, because even though he has to marry Leah, he's allowed to marry Rachel as long as he agrees to work 7 years. So now he's got one wife he doesn't want and one wife he does want, and that's pretty much a recipe for disaster. Verse 32, Leah bears Reuben. Verse 33, Simeon. Verse 34, Levi. And 35, and Judah. Genesis 30, Jacob and his sons prosper. Verse 1, Rachel, in grief for her barrenness, gives Bilhah, her maid, unto Jacob. What is that? Where do we remember that from? Verse 5, Bilhah bears Dan and Naphtali. Verse 9, Leah gives Zilpah, her maid, and who bears Gad and Asher. So we really have a mix, and these are the tribes. 14, Reuben finds mandrakes. There's 15, and with which Leah buys her husband's company of Rachel. And verse 17, Leah bears Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Verse 22, Rachel bears Joseph. Verse 25, Jacob desires to depart. Verse 27, Laban detains him on a new agreement. 37 is Jacob's policy whereby he becomes rich. Genesis 31, Jacob leaves for Canaan and Laban pursues. Verse 1, Jacob displeased with the envy of Laban and his sons, and he departs secretly. Verse 19, Rachel steals her father's household gods. Verse 22, Laban pursues after him and complains of the wrong. And verse 34, Rachel's plan to hide the images. Verse 36, Jacob's complaint of Laban. Verse 43, the covenant of Laban and Jacob at Galil. These are just the major verses in these chapters. Verse 32, Jacob prepares to meet Esau and wrestle with God. Verse 1, Jacob's vision at Manham. Verse 3, his message to Esau. Verse 6, he is afraid of Esau's coming. I preach a sermon about here comes Esau, because fear had driven Jacob, and everything he did, it was in fear. But when he saw Esau, the thing he feared, Esau fell on his neck and kissed him. So, but he's afraid of Esau's coming. Verse 9, he prays for deliverance. Verse 13, he sends a present to Esau and passes the brook Jabbok. Verse 24, he wrestles with an angel at Peniel. and he is called Israel, and this is a theophany. He wrestles with the theophany. Verse 31, he calls. There's all kinds of spiritual teaching in that chapter. How can God Almighty, who is in a theophany, how can he be overcome by a human being? But there's a lot of things that are in the spiritual realm there, and so it tells us a lot about how powerful we are in the spirit. Genesis 33, Jacob meets Esau, settles in Shechem. Verse 1, Jacob and Esau's meeting, Esau's departure. Verse 17, Jacob comes to Succoth. 18, at Shechem, he buys a field and he builds an altar, and it's called El Eloi Israel. And Genesis 34, Shechem defiles Dinah and is avenged by Jacob. Verse 1, Dinah is ravished, raped by Shechem. Verse 4, he requests to marry her. Verse 13, the sons of Jacob offer the condition of circumcision to the Shechemites. And verse 20, Hamor and Shechem persuade them to accept this. Verse 25, the sons of Jacob, upon that advantage, slay them and spoil their city. Because when you have circumcision, just to be blunt, you don't feel great. And they were circumcised, and when they were trying to recover from that, then the sons of Jacob fell on them and slew them. They set this up. And verse 30, Jacob reproves Simeon and Levi. Genesis 35, Jacob returns to Bethel. Jacob named Israel, and the deaths of Rachel and Isaac. Now, verse 1, God commands Jacob to go to Bethel. Verse 2, he purges his house of idols. Those idols that had been brought, he put them away. Verse 6, he builds an altar at Bethel. Verse 8, Deborah dies at Allon Bacuth. Verse 9, God blesses Jacob at Bethel. Verse 10, Jacob named Israel. Verse 16, Rachel travails of Benjamin and dies on the way to Edar. Verse 22, Reuben lies with Bilhah. Verse 23, the sons of Jacob. Verse 27, Jacob comes to Isaac at Hebron. Verse 28 is the age, the death, the burial of Isaac. All this is getting set up for the other books. And we're going to go through all the Pentateuch books as we kind of lay a foundation. Genesis 36, descendants of Esau, kings of Edom. Verse 1, Esau's 3 wives. Verse 6, his removal to Mount Seir. Verse 9, his sons. Verse 15, the dukes which descended of his sons. Verse 20, the sons and dukes of Seir, the Horite. Verse 24, Anna finds the mules. Verse 31, the kings of Edom. Verse 40, the dukes that descended of Esau. Verse 37, in Genesis 37, and as I say, Moses had a lot of this information in these genealogies that he used for this book. Genesis 37, Joseph's dreams and betrayal by his brother. Joseph, verse 1, is loved by Jacob, but hated by his brothers. Verse 5, his dream and the interpretation. Verse 12, Jacob sends him to his brothers who can counsel to slay him. Verse 21, at Reuben's desire, they cast him into a pit. Verse 25, and afterwards, there's a misprint there, and afterwards sell him to the Ishmaelites. Verse 29, while Reuben grieves at not finding him. Verse 31, his coat covered with blood is sent to Jacob, who mourns him inordinately. Verse 36, Joseph is brought to Egypt and sold to Potiphar. Genesis 38 is Judah and Tamar. Verse 1, Judah begots Onan, and Shelah. Number 6, verse 6, Er's marriage with Tamar and death. 8, the trespass of Onan. Verse 11, Tamar is reserved for Shelah. Verse 12, Judah's wife dies. Verse 13, Tamar deceives Judah. Number 12, verse 27, she bears twins, Pharez and Zerah. Chapter 39, Joseph's success. Potiphar's wife, Joseph imprisoned. Verse 1, Joseph is bought by Potiphar and preferred in the family. Verse 7, he resists temptation by Potiphar's wife. Verse 13, he's falsely accused by her. Verse 20, he's cast into prison. Verse 21, God is with him there, and he is advanced by the keeper of the prison. Genesis 40, Joseph interprets the cupbearer and baker's dream. Verse 1, the chief butler and baker of Pharaoh are also in prison. Verse 5, Joseph interprets their dreams. Verse 20, they are accomplished according to his interpretation. And of course, in looking at the life of Joseph, which we're going to get into after we get past these, there's so much about the providence of God in this. It is the providence of God. He's down, he's up, he's down, he's up. But just because you happen to be down doesn't mean that God's finished with it. He's going to bring about his purpose. And so, verse 23, the ingratitude of the butler in forgetting Joseph. Genesis 41 is the Pharaoh's dream, Joseph's interpretation, and reward. Number one, Pharaoh had two dreams. Verse 9, Joseph interprets those dreams. Verse 33, he gives Pharaoh counsel and is highly advanced and married. Verse 46, the 7 years of plenty. Verse 50, he begets children. Verse 53, the famine begins. Genesis 42, Joseph's brothers sent to Egypt, and Simeon is detained. Verse 1, Jacob sends his 10 sons to buy grains in Egypt. Verse 16, they are imprisoned by Joseph as spies. Verse 18, they are set at liberty on condition to bring Benjamin. Verse 21, they have remorse for Joseph. Verse 24, Simeon is kept for a pledge. Verse 25, they return with grain and their money. Verse 29, their relation to Jacob. Verse 36, Jacob refuses to send Benjamin. Genesis 43, they return to Egypt with Benjamin. Verse 1, Jacob is persuaded to send Benjamin. Verse 15, Joseph entertains his brothers. Verse 19, they discover their fears to the steward. Verse 26, Joseph makes them a feast. Genesis 44, Benjamin and the silver cup. Joseph's policy, verse 1, to stay his brothers. Verse 6, the silver cup is found in Benjamin's sack. Verse 14, they are brought before Joseph. Verse 18, Judah's humble supplication to Joseph. Chapter 45, Joseph makes himself known and he forgives his brothers. This is all that providence of God. It's an amazing story. And Joseph is one of the most perfect types of Jesus Christ there is in the Bible. Verse 1, Joseph makes himself known to his brothers. Verse 5, he comforts them in God's providence. Verse 9, he sends for his father. Verse 16, Pharaoh confirms it. Verse 21, Joseph furnishes them for their journey. And then Jacob is revived, verse 25, with the news. Genesis 46, Jacob and his family move to Egypt. Verse 1, Jacob is comforted by God at Beersheba. Verse 5, thence he with his company goes into Egypt. Verse 8, the number of his family that went into Egypt. Verse 28, and by the way, there's about 70 that was in Egypt about this time. And by the time they get into the promised land, their estimate is of 2.5 million. And they get on the other side. So that's they took God serious when he said, be fruitful and multiply. Verse 28, Joseph meets Jacob. Verse 31, he instructs his brothers how to answer Pharaoh. Genesis 47, Jacob goes to Goshen, Israelites multiply, Joseph and the famine. Verse 1, Joseph presents his father, 5 of his brothers before Pharaoh. Verse 11, he gives them habitation and maintenance. Verse 13, he gives the Egyptians money. Verse 16, their cattle. Verse 18, and their lands, except the priests to Pharaoh. Verse 23, he restores the land for a fifth. Verse 28 is Jacob's age. Verse 29, he swears Joseph to bury him with his fathers. So he gets Joseph, he said, please, when you leave this land of Egypt, take my bones also. Genesis 48, Jacob's illness, Manasseh and Ephraim. Verse 1 is Joseph with his sons visits his sick father. Verse 2, Jacob strengthens himself to bless them. Verse 3, he repeats God's promise. Verse 5, he takes Ephraim and Manasseh as his own son. Verse 7, he tells Joseph of his mother's grave. Verse 8, he blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. Verse 17, he prefers the younger before the elder. Verse 21, he prophesies their return to Canaan. Verse 49, Jacob's blessings to his son and Jacob's death. Verse 1, Jacob calls his son to bless them. Verse 3, their blessings in particular. Verse 29, he charges them about his burial. Verse 33, he dies. Genesis 50, which is the last chapter of Genesis, the burial of Jacob, the death of Joseph. Number 1, the mourning for Jacob. Verse 4, Joseph gets leave of Pharaoh to go and bury him. Verse 7 is the funeral. Verse 15, Joseph comforts his brothers who crave his pardon. Verse 22, his age. Verse 23, he sees the third generation of his sons. Verse 24, he prophesies unto his brothers of their return. Verse 25, he takes an oath of them concerning his bones. Verse 26, he dies and he's put into a coffin. And there is that pledge, don't leave my bones in Egypt. Take them. We just went through 2,400 years of history. And that's what Moses wrote. And as I say, some of that had to be from genealogies. Did you know that, well, I'll get to this, but that when you get back into the very beginnings of those chapters in Genesis, some scholars say there could have been as much as 200,000 years that elapsed in some of those genealogies because they're selective. We don't know the generations in between. The earth, probably, where did Cain get his wife? Probably by the time Cain killed his brother Abel, there could have been as much as 200,000 to 300,000 people on the earth at that time. Because we don't have all that information. This is just really a sketchy overview, and there's a lot of time in between. So, we'll get to all that as we go along. But anyway, let's go on. I don't want to bore you with these outlines, but we're just kind of reviewing this because we're going to take these books in order, and there's a lot of information in there that understanding how the book unfolds will help you. So you have Exodus. Exodus 1 is the Israelites multiply and the oppression in Egypt. So there is a tremendous population explosion. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why, when we get there, why that the Egyptians felt threatened by the Israelites. And believe it or not, it actually has to do with circumcision. But that's a mystery that I will unravel later. Exodus 1, Israelites multiply oppression in Egypt. Now, verse 1, the children of Israel after Joseph's death, they increase. Verse 8, the more they are oppressed by a new king, the more they multiply. Verse 15, the godliness of the midwives in saving the male children alive. Verse 22, Pharaoh commands the male children to be cast into the river. Exodus chapter 2, the birth, adoption, and escape of Moses. So Moses is born, verse 1, placed in a basket in the reeds of the Nile. Verse 5, he is found and brought up to Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 7, he who employs his mother to nurse him. So he gets an Egyptian education and a Hebrew education. Verse 11, he kills an Egyptian, which tells us that his mother has been telling him a lot of things about Hebrews. She has really taught him about the Hebrew nation, because when the push comes to shove, he kills an Egyptian in defense of the Hebrew. And verse 13, he reproves the Hebrew. Verse 15, he flees into Midian and he marries Zipporah. Verse 22, Gershom is born. Verse 23, God respects the Israelites' cry. Exodus 3, Moses and the burning bush. Moses is keeping Jethro's flock. So the first 40 years has elapsed in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. Exodus 3, Moses at the burning bush. Moses keeps Jethro's flocks. He starts into the second 40 years. God appears to him in a burning bush. He sends him to deliver Israel, verse 9. Verse 2, he appears in the burning bush. Verse 1, tends to the flock. Verse 13, the name of God, I am that I am. Verse 15, his message to Israel and Pharaoh, whose opposition is foretold. Verse 20, he is assured of Israel's deliverance. Exodus 4, now we come to the last 40 years. So chapters 1 through 3 takes 80 years of Moses' life. Exodus 4, miraculous signs through Moses, Aaron as the mouthpiece, and Moses returns. Verse 1 is his rod is turned into a serpent. Number 6, his hand is leprous. Number 10, he loathes his calling. Number 13, Aaron is appointed to assist him. Verse 18, Moses departs from Jethro. Verse 21, God's message to Pharaoh. Verse 24, Zipporah circumcises her son. Verse 27, Aaron is sent to meet Moses. Verse 29, the people believe them. Exodus 5, Pharaoh rejects Moses' plea and increases the Israelites' labor. Verse 1, he chides Moses and Aaron for their message. Verse 6, he increases the Israelites' tasks. Number 16, he ignores their complaints. Number 19, they cry out to Moses and Aaron. Verse 22, Moses complains to God. Exodus 6, God promises to deliver the families of Israel. Verse 1, God renews his promise by his name Jehovah, or Yahweh. Verse 9, Moses vainly attempts to encourage the Israelites. Number 10, he and Aaron are again sent to Pharaoh. And number 14, verse 14, genealogies of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, of whom came Moses and Aaron. Verse 26, the history is resumed. For Exodus 7 is Aaron's staff, the plague of blood. Verse 1, Moses and Aaron are encouraged to go up again to Pharaoh. Verse 8, Aaron's rod is turned into a serpent. Verse 11, the sorcerers do the like, but their rods are swallowed up by Aaron's. Verse 13, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Verse 14, God's message to Pharaoh. Verse 19, the river is turned into blood, and the consequent distress of the Egyptians. Exodus 8 is the plague of the frogs, the gnats, the flies. Verse 1, the frogs are sent. Verse 8, Pharaoh complains to Moses, who by prayer removes them. Verse 16, the dust is turned into lice, which the magicians could not do. Verse 20, the plague of flies. Verse 25, Pharaoh inclines to let the people go, but yet is hardened. Exodus 9, plagues of livestock, boils, and hail. Verse 1, the plague on the livestock. Verse 8, the plague of boils. Verse 13, the message of Moses about the hail. Verse 22, the plague of hail. Verse 27, Pharaoh pleads with Moses, but yet is hardened. He's kind of hard. He's hardened in the heart and the head. Exodus 10, plagues of locusts and darkness. Verse 1, God threatens to send locusts. Verse 7, Pharaoh, moved by his servants, inclines to let the Israelites go. Verse 12, the plague of the locusts. Verse 16, Pharaoh entreats Moses. Verse 21, the plague of darkness. Verse 24, Pharaoh again entreats Moses, but is yet hardened. Exodus 11, the plague on the firstborn. Verse 1, God's message to the Israelites to borrow jewels of their neighbors. Verse 4, Moses threatens Pharaoh with the death of the firstborn. Exodus 12, Passover, feast, memorial. Pharaoh urges the Exodus. Verse 1 is the beginning of the year is changed. So there's a change in the calendar for the Jews. Verse 3, the Passover is instituted. Verse 11, the import of the rite of the Passover. Verse 15, unleavened bread. A lot of these are feasts in Israel. Verse 29, the firstborn are slain. Verse 31, the Israelites are driven out of the land. 37, they come to Succoth. Verse 41, the time of their sojourning. And verse 43, the ordinance of the Passover. Exodus 13 is the consecration of the firstborn, and God leads the people out. Verse 1, the firstborn are sanctified to God. And verse 3, the memorial of the Passover is commanded. Verse 11, the firstborn of man and beast are set apart. Verse 17, the Israelites go out of Egypt and carry Joseph's bones with them. Verse 20, they come to Etham. Verse 21, God guides them by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Chapter 14, Pharaoh pursues and the Red Sea is parted. Verse 1, God instructs the Israelites on their journey. Verse 5, Pharaoh pursues after them. Verse 10, the Israelites murmur. Verse 13, that's amazing right there. They murmur after all they just seen. Verse 13, Moses comforts them. Verse 15, God instructs Moses. Verse 19, the cloud removes behind the camp. Verse 21, the Israelites pass through the Red Sea, and then the Red Sea comes back together and drowns the Egyptians. Which I saw a documentary on this, and they found that place where they crossed the sea, and they found the chariots upended and all of that under the water. Archaeologists have found the spot. So anyway, Exodus 15, the song of Moses and Miriam, and the Lord provides water. Verse 1, the song of Moses, Miriam, and Israel on their deliverance. Verse 22, the people want water in the desert. Verse 23, the water and Mara are bitter. Verse 24, they murmur. Verse 25, Moses prays and sweetens the water by God's direction. Verse 27, they camp at Elim, where are 12 wells and 70 palm trees. It's an oasis. Exodus 16, manna, quail, and the Sabbath. Verse 1, the Israelites came to sin and murmur for want of bread. Verse 4, God promises them bread and meat from heaven, and they are rebuked. Verse 13, quail and manna are sent. Verse 16, the ordering of the manna. Verse 25, it is not to be found on the Sabbath. Verse 24, an omer of it is preserved. Remember, it couldn't be preserved. You didn't hoard it up. Whatever you didn't eat in a day, it was spoiled.
Yeah.
Except the Sabbath day, you kept it the day before the Sabbath, and it didn't spoil.
Right.
And they could eat that on the Sabbath, and they didn't gather manna on the Sabbath. Exodus 17, water from the rock, and the defeat of the Amalekites. And you notice as you look at some of these ancient enemies, it kind of ties together with things that happened later on in the Old Testament. Why God had such an attitude towards certain people. Why would he want Saul to kill all the Amalekites? Mm-hmm. Well, they're an ancient enemy in rebellion against God. So number 1, the people murmur for water to Rephidim. Number 6, God sends them for water to the rock in Horeb. The verse 7, the place is called Massa and Meribath. Verse 8, Amalek is overcome by Joshua while Moses holds up his hand. Remember that? As long as his hands were up, they had victory. When his hands were down, they didn't. So they appointed those to hold his hands up so he could have victory. Verse 14, Amalek is doomed to destruction, and Moses builds the altar, Jehovah Nissi. Exodus 18, that's in Revelation. There's a revelation. Somewhere along the line, I'm going to give you some information just to have in your notes about all the names of God. Those revelation names of God. Exodus 18, Jethro visits and counsels Moses. Number 1, verse 1, Jethro brings his wife and 2 sons to Moses. Verse 7, Moses entertains him and relates the goodness of the Lord. Verse 9, Jethro rejoices, blesses God, and offers sacrifice. Verse 13, he gives good counsel, which is accepted. Verse 27, Jethro departs. Exodus 19, Moses and the Lord at Mount Sinai. Verse 1, the people arrive at Sinai. Now, there's 2 Mount Sinai's. And the reason why that they couldn't find where they crossed the Red Sea is because there is a traditional, and then there is another Mount Sinai that, the one that is traditionally done, it couldn't possibly be the right Mount Sinai because there's not a plain where the children of Israel could gather. But there's another one that is translated Mount Sinai. It is has been known for generations at Mount Sinai. It's just not the traditional place. It has a plain, and that's where they found the chariots upended. So that's where they arrived. And you should be able to find that in your maps, by the way, both of those locations in your packet. If you don't have a packet, let us know. We'll make sure you get it. All that information is in there. Verse 3, God's message by Moses unto the people of the mount. They stay here for a long time at this mountain. Verse 8, the people are prepared again the third day for the giving of the law. Verse 12, the mountain must not be touched. Verse 16, the fearful presence of God upon the mountain. God said, don't touch this mountain. Stay clear. Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments were spoken by Jehovah. The 10 Commandments are the core commandments. Verse 18, the people are afraid. Moses comforts him. Verse 21, idolatry is forbidden. Verse 23, of what sort the altar should be. So that is a description of the altar, how the altar should be constructed. Exodus 21, ordinances for servants and personal injuries. We're going to get into these laws. There were verse 1, law for men servants. Verse 5, for the servant whose ear is bored. Verse 7, for women servants. Verse 12, for manslaughter. Verse 16, for kidnappers. Verse 17, for cursers of parents. Verse 18, for smiters. Verse 22, for those who are hurt by chance. Verse 28, for an ox that gores. Verse 33, for him who is an occasion of harm. Exodus 22 is property rights and social laws. Verse 1 of theft. Verse 5 of damages. Verse 7 of trespasses. Verse 14 of borrowing. Verse 16 of fornication. Verse 18 of witchcraft. Verse 19 of bestiality. Verse 20 of idolatry. Verse 21 of strangers, widows, and fatherless. Verse 25 of usury. Verse 26 of pledges. Verse 28 of reverence to magistrates. Verse 29 of first fruits. Verse 31 of torn flesh. Exodus 33, laws of justice, mercy, Sabbath, annual festivals, and conquest. Verse 1 of slander, false witness, and partiality. Verse 4 of charitableness. Verse 6 of justice and judgment. Verse 8 of taking bribes. Verse 9 of oppressing a stranger. Verse 10 of the year of rest. Verse 12 of the Sabbath. Verse 13 of idolatry. Verse 14 of the 3 feasts. Verse 18 of the blood and the fat of the sacrifice. And verse 20, an angel is promised with a blessing if they obey him. Exodus 24, the people affirm the covenant with God. Verse 1, Moses is called up into the mountain. Verse 3, the people promise obedience. Verse 4, Moses builds an altar and 12 pillars. Verse 6, he sprinkles the blood of the covenant. Verse 9, the glory of God appears. Verse 14, Aaron and Hur have the charge of the people. Verse 15, Moses goes into the mountain where he continues 40 days and 40 nights. And then Exodus 25 is the tabernacle offerings, the ark, the table, the lampstands. What the Israelites, verse 1, were to offer for the building of the tabernacle. Verse 10 is the dimensions of the ark. And by the way, there's a very detailed description of the ark. Our next course is on the tabernacle, and that will be in August. It's tremendous study. But the ark, if you go into the book of Deuteronomy, it just says it's a box made of shittim wood. And I think the reason for that is that in the book of Deuteronomy, there's Moses giving sermons. He's just giving details. He's not trying to tell all the things that the ark was. Some people will make something out of that. They say, well, see, there's one description in Deuteronomy and there's one description in Exodus. But it's not, and it's in Deuteronomy 10 if you want to read. But I think it's here they're actually giving, and there may have even been prior to the ark, there may have been a box, which became part of the ark, and then this is the finished product. And the dimensions are given beginning with verse 10. Verse 17 is the mercy seat with the cherubim. Verse 23 is the table of shewbread with the furniture. And then verse 31, the golden candlestick with the instruments thereof. Exodus 26, the instructions for the tabernacle, the curtains, the boards, the veil. Verse 1, the 10 curtains of the tabernacle. And all this is amazingly symbolic. So many types and shadows. Verse 7, the 11 curtains of goat's hair, the covering of rams and badger skins. Verse 15, the boards of the tabernacle with their sockets and bars. Verse 31, the veil for the ark. Verse 36, the hanging of the door. Hanging for the door. Exodus 27, instructions for the altar and courtyard, and oil for the lampstand. Verse 1, the altar of burnt offering with vessels thereof. Verse 9, the court of the tabernacle enclosed with hangings and pillars. Verse 18, the measure of the court and the furniture of brass. Number 20, the oil for the lamp. When we go through the tabernacle, you see all of these things down to the minutest detail had meaning. Exodus 28, priestly garments, ephod, breastplate, or breastpiece. Verse 1, Aaron and his sons are set apart for the priest office. You had to be a descendant of Aaron to be a priest. You had to be a descendant of Levi to be a Levite. You had to be in that tribe. But only even Aaron was both a Levite and he was a priest. But only the descendants of Aaron. And if they have a high priest in Israel today, and they say they're going to, and they're going to build the temple, and they say they have all the vessels and they know where the ark is, that's what they say, he has to be a descendant of Aaron, that high priest. So, verse 2, holy garments are appointed. Verse 6, the ephod and the girdle. Verse 15, the breastplate with 12 precious stones. Verse 30, the Urim and the Thummim. Verse 31, the robe of the ephod with the pomegranates and the bells. Verse 36, as we go along, I'll tell you something about the pomegranate. That's another little miracle that's included, and I'll tell you why that is when we get to it. But anyway, verse 36, the plate of the mitre. Verse 39, the embroidered coat. Verse 40, the garments for Aaron's sons. Exodus 39 is consecration, sacrifices, and food for the priests. Verse 1, the sacrifices and ceremonies of consecrating the priests and the altar. Verse 38, the continual burnt offerings. Verse 45, God's promise to dwell among the children of Israel. Exodus 30, the altar of incense, the atonement money, the basin, the anointing oil. Verse 1, the altar of incense. Verse 11, the ransom of souls. Verse 17 is the bronze basin. Verse 22, the holy anointing oil. And verse 34 is the composition of the incense. Exodus 31 is the craftsmen, Bezalel and Aholiab, and the Sabbath explained. So, verse 1, these two men built the tabernacle. They were appointed. Bezalel and Aholiab. They were appointed to work the work of the tabernacle. Verse 12, the observation of the Sabbath is again commanded. Verse 18, Moses receives the 2 tablets. Exodus 32 is the golden calf and Moses' anger. Verse 1, the people in the absence of Moses caused Aaron to make a calf. 7, God informs Moses, who intercedes for Israel and prevails. Verse 15, Moses comes down with the tablets. Verse 19, he breaks them. Verse 20, he destroys the calf. Verse 22, Aaron's excuse for himself. Verse 25, Moses caused the idolaters to be slain. Verse 30, he prays for the people. Exodus 33, Moses resumes the journey and intercedes for the Israelites. Verse 1, the Lord refuses to go as he had promised with the people. Verse 4, the people mourn there. Verse 7, the tabernacle is removed out of the camp. Verse 9, the Lord talks very familiar with Moses. He gets very familiar, face to face. Verse 12, Moses prevails with God and desires to see his glory. I love that. Show me your glory. God said, you can't see my glory and die and live, you're going to die. Mm-hmm. But he said, I'll show you the hinder parts. He hit him and he says, you'll see me as I pass by. Exodus 34, tablets replaced, covenant renewed, radiant face of Moses. Number 1, the tablets are replaced. Number 5, the name of the Lord is proclaimed. Number 8, Moses entreats God to go with them. I'm not going to go if you don't go. Number 10, God makes a covenant with them, repeating certain duties. Verse 28, Moses, after 40 days in the mountain, comes down with the tablets. Number 29, his face is radiant, and he covers it with a veil. Can you imagine? He just reflects the glory of God, and they can't even look at that. So Exodus 35, Sabbath rules, workmen and gifts for the tabernacle. Number 1, the Sabbath. Number 4, free gifts for the tabernacle. Verse 20, the readiness of the people to offer. Number 30, Bezalel and Aholiab are called to the work. I'm gonna get done with Exodus, and then we'll take a break. Exodus 36, Bezalel and Aholiab, gifts, tabernacle construction. Verse 1, the offerings are delivered to the workmen. Verse 4, the generosity of the people is restrained. Can you imagine? They were so generous that God had to say, that's enough. You don't have to give anymore. I don't think there's ever been a time when any pastor that I've ever known of had to say that. Verse 8, the curtains with the cherubim. Verse 14, the curtains of goat's hair. Verse 19, the covering of skins. Verse 20, the boards with their sockets. 31, the bars. 35, the veil. 37, the hanging for the door. Exodus 37, the ark, the table, the lampstand, the altar of incense. Verse 1, the ark and the mercy seat with cherubim are made. Verse 10, the table of shewbread with its vessels. Verse 17, the candlestick with its lamps and instruments. Verse 25, the altar of incense is made. Verse 29, the anointing oil and sweet incense is instituted. Exodus 38, altar of burnt offering, basin, courtyard completed, and the costs are all totaled up. Verse 1, the altar of burnt offering. Verse 8, the laver of brass is placed. Verse 9, the court and its hangings are put in. 21, the sum of what people offered and the use to which it is applied. There is an accounting of everything. Verse Exodus 29, the priestly garments. Moses inspects the completed work. Verse 1, the clothes of service and holy garments. 2, the ephod. Number 8, the breastplate. Number 22, the robe of the ephod. Number 27, the coats and mitre and girdle of fine linen. Verse 30, the plate of the holy crown. 32, all is finished, reviewed, and approved by Moses. So there's all you have the commandment of these things, and then you have the completion of these things. Exodus 40, the tabernacle is erected and filled by the glory of the Lord. That must have been something. Number 1, the tabernacle is commanded to be reared, anointed, and consecrated. 13, Aaron and his sons to be sanctified. And verse 16, Moses performs all things accordingly. 34, a cloud covers the tabernacle. So we're going to go, let's just take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll pick up with Leviticus. We're going to go through these outlines, and then we're going to go back and get into the teachings of the book. There's several things in these books I think will be of great interest to you.